Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here today to listen to my talk that is titled Fishing for Food. And we're going to focus on inland lakes in Wisconsin today and think about how we can quantify recreational fisheries harvest from those Wisconsin lakes. This project has been a collaboration with some folks at USGS, as well as the Center for Limnology and many folks at Wisconsin DNR, where we have used data and taken lots of insights and stuff. So certainly want to address the collaborators on this project before we get started. All right. So getting started, also, I want to, before we dive too deep, recreational fisheries are kind of this fuzzy fishery, basically, where some folks are super into trophy fishing and some folks are super into consuming the fish and subsistence driven fisheries. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page and starting from the same definition of what a recreational fishery is. So for our purposes here, we're going to use the FAO definition, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, their definition of a recreational fishery, which includes the fishing of aquatic animals that do not constitute the individual's primary resource to meet basic nutritional needs. So basically, recreational fisheries are fisheries where the main motivation is for leisure and not necessarily for putting food on the table, although that is a potential byproduct of the activity. And so we'll dive into that. So, all right. So inland recreational fisheries specifically are these ecosystem service hotspots where they offer great cultural benefits to folks. It's one of the main ways, especially in developed countries, where people actually interact with nature. They may not be willing to go on a long hike outside, but they're certainly willing to sit on a cold frozen lake and fish for a while. Inland recreational fisheries also have a lot of effects on the ecological balance of ecosystems. They offer great economic benefits valued globally at $190 billion and employ over 60 million people annually. And then the subsistence element, how much fish are actually providing as food from inland recreational fisheries, we know is large, but we have really no understanding of what that actual magnitude is. Our understanding of fish as food really comes from mainly marine sources and overall commercial landings. And so our understanding of the role that fish play as a food source again, comes from commercial sources, despite the fact that the majority of people, especially in developed countries, are participating in recreational fisheries. And so one of the key things that we're trying to figure out with this project is really how do we measure inland recreational fisheries, both the magnitude, so how much fish is being harvested or how much fish are people catching in recreational fisheries, and does that change over time? And what are those drivers across space, and does that change? So to do that and to think about that, scale became a very important thing that we were thinking about. So when we think about an inland recreational fishery, a lot of the times it looks like this, a small little lake. At least in our region, I should say, we're thinking about the Midwest here. So for our region, lots of them look like these small lakes, and creel surveys or angler surveys to understand what a recreational fishery looks like is mostly the surveys are done on individual water bodies. And so our information about recreational fisheries is largely limited to individual systems. And little work has been done to scale up from that. When folks have tried to understand broader scale patterns of recreational fisheries, they've done that, but it's really been taken at a global approach. And so they've kind of made some large scale assumptions that say the harvest rate in Canada applies around the world. And so then that would result in so-and-so harvest, total annual harvest for all inland water bodies across the world, really taking some large scale assumptions there. So it's somewhat of a Goldilocks situation. What is this most meaningful scale we can take potentially in this case, the state of Wisconsin, inland lakes in the state of Wisconsin, to meaningfully understand the magnitude and drivers of recreational fisheries on our landscape, basically. And so that's what we tried to do here, is take the state of Wisconsin and inland lakes in the state of Wisconsin and say, how much fish are coming out of those lakes? Does that change over time? Does that change over space? And what does that really look like? So specifically for this project, we looked at what are the drivers of inland recreational fisheries harvest in Wisconsin lakes? How many fish are harvested by inland recreational anglers? And then have species-specific harvest and angler effort changed over time? So fortunately in Wisconsin, we have amazing data courtesy of the Department of Natural Resources, where they do these randomly stratified rotating annual creel surveys going back to 1990. On this map here, I've highlighted the locations where we were able to get data, empirical creel estimates from inland lakes. And so in this data set, we have coverage of 267 lakes, and some lakes were revisited over that sampling period, so represented 573 lake year combinations or surveys. Again, you may notice here that they're quite, there's more survey coverage in the northern part of the state. That is both a representation of where the majority of water bodies are in Wisconsin, as well as where the management system has been focused on their sampling approach because of walleye focus, basically, for Wisconsin. For each survey, so in each lake year, we then are able to, we have empirical estimates of the species-specific number and mean length of fish harvested from each water body, as well as species-specific angler effort. And so this is really fantastic information. It goes kind of, yeah, I'll dive into it in a little bit more, but comparatively to other states, this is absolutely great info to have. So this is the information, the majority of which we use to answer our questions that I'll be going through today. So for each species in a survey, we wanted to then estimate the biomass that was harvested from a lake, not just the number of species or number of fish for each species. And so we used some literature-based length-weight relationships to combine with our creel estimates to then estimate biomass harvested for each species. And so for each survey, we end up with species 1 biomass harvest, species 2 biomass harvest, which we then combined, standardized per unit area to get our harvest in kilograms per unit area for a given water body. And that's what we're going to use to then scale up to the whole state. So then to take those individual water body empirical estimates and scale up to the entire state to get an idea of the actual annual harvest from all water bodies in the state of Wisconsin, we developed a generalized additive mixed effects model, which is a type of model that basically allows you to fit both linear and non-linear drivers, and as well as incorporate mixed effects, so random effects like lake and year in this case, where some lakes were revisited over time, and so it incorporates time and space as the variance in the model. The model of best fit that we found to predict harvest per unit area included an angler access metric driver, the distance to nearest road, secchi depth, so metric of productivity, a couple thermal characteristics, so the mean bottom temperature of the lake in June, potentially incorporating some of the bathymetry of a lake there, the growing degree days exceeding 5 degrees Celsius of the lake, as well as conductance. And then we, like I said, also fit lake and year as random effects, so incorporating the spatial and temporal variability in the sampling surveys. A little bit more specifically about the drivers of harvest that we found. So distance to nearest road and secchi depth, those relationships were both negatively linear. So as you increase harvest, you decrease your distance to the nearest road and decrease your secchi depth, your harvest would increase. So kind of goes with what you think, as a lake becomes more inaccessible, it's going to be harvested less. And as a lake is, in this case, as water gets clearer, potentially less productive, there's potentially less fish biomass in there and less fish to harvest, that type of thing. Then for our thermal characteristics, they were both non-linearly positive. So these are the relationships here, where as you increase harvest, temperature increases, harvest increases. Those seem to have kind of this intermediate temperate point where temperature doesn't seem to matter so much, but on the extremes, it matters more. And then for conductance was also positively nonlinear, but seemed to have more of a plateau point where above a certain conductance, it no longer really mattered, and harvest didn't seem to increase beyond that. So conductance more important at lower values. All right, so to summarize again, angler access and Secchi depth, so the proxy of productivity, both were linearly negative with harvest. Our thermal characteristics were positively nonlinear, and conductance was also positively nonlinear. So basically what we found is as lakes, as you get further away from a lake and it gets less productive and colder and has less solids in it, it's going to have less harvest on it. Okay, so once we use that model to then predict on as many water bodies as we could for big lakes that we had data available, here is what we found. In the figure here, it shows the map of Wisconsin. The colored circles indicate water bodies where we were able to predict harvest. Color indicates harvest level, so darker indicating higher harvest. And then the size of the circle indicates the size of the lake. The little black triangles are where we had empirical creel estimates. So we were able to predict harvest for 73% of lakes or 73% of the surface area of water of lakes in Wisconsin. And estimated about 3,500 metric tons were harvested annually from the state. And then we found a mean harvest of about 5 kilograms per hectare. When we apply that to the remaining 25% of surface area that we weren't able to predict upon because of data limitations, we get a grand total of 4,200 metric tons harvested annually from inland lakes in Wisconsin. And so what does that really mean? We wanted a key point of this was not only to understand how much fish was coming out, but also how that kind of related to folks' consumption levels and whether a fish is a source of food. And so we wanted to understand, basically how much folks were actually eating from that. So a little back of the envelope, we took a fillet yield from the literature. So most of our species are dominated by bluegill and purses. We'll go into that in a little bit. So those have a fillet yield of about 35%. And then multiply that by the angling population during the study period, which was about 1.4 million anglers, to get an angler consumption rate of 1.1 kilograms per angler. And so again, that may not seem that much. This is annually that anglers are only eating 1.1 kilograms, but this is scaled for all anglers, the whole angler population, those who don't eat any fish, the trophy folks, to folks who eat tons of fish, and that's a huge source of their diet. Okay, how does that compare to other freshwater fish consumption in the US? When we look at 1.1 kilograms per angler compared to all sources of freshwater fish consumption, all sources being commercial sources, folks are eating about 1.8 kilograms per person. And so that's not a huge difference there as far as consumption rates, indicating that these recreational food sources likely provide an important source of food, especially for this angling population. And further, if these folks were to buy that fish in a grocery store using just kind of a generic $15 per kilogram, so a kilogram is 2.2 pounds. That's about $63 million that goes unmeasured in economic value just in the state of Wisconsin, just from inland lakes. That's not rivers, that's not wetlands, that's just inland recreational fisheries harvest. So lots of food, lots of money that's not really being measured, not really being valued, and seems to be very important, especially for certain communities. Okay, so what did that species level breakdown look like? What comprised this harvest? So in Wisconsin, the majority of harvest was comprised of about 10 species. I've highlighted them here with little circles. On this figure, we've got year on the x-axis and species name on the y. And then the little tiles show harvest level in a given year, darker colors, again, indicating higher harvest levels. So I should say median annual harvest level for that year, for that species. So you can kind of see how some species have changed over time. So again, the majority of harvest was comprised of about 10 species, mostly centrarchids, black crappie, bluegill, as well as percids, so walleye, yellow perch, and then lake whitefish and northern pike. Diving a little bit deeper into those trends of the species that comprise the majority of harvest, so those 10 species, we've got a figure here where we've got on this top panel the proportion of harvest on the y-axis as a percentage, year on the x-axis for all of these panels, and then species colored for each panel as well, and the species color is shown at the legend at the top. So so that's the top panel is at the top, and then the panel bottom left shows harvest over time, and then the panel on the right shows effort over time, species specific effort. So basically what we found is that species that followed harvest and effort changes, we found declines in muskie, muskellunge, and walleye, and increases in black crappie and largemouth bass, indicating these species may be becoming less, muskie and walleye may be becoming less harvest oriented, whereas black crappie and largemouth bass may be becoming more. Again, these trends also follow species abundance shifts. I'll touch on this in a little bit. So there's kind of a lot going on here, but anglers may be detecting these shifts and then following up on that. Muskie is a little bit different story, but walleye, black crappie, and largemouth bass certainly are mirroring species abundance shifts. Bluegill showed a harvest increase, but no effort change. So potentially indicating there's been less release over time, and bluegill are becoming more consumptively, species of more consumption interest for folks. Smallmouth bass and pumpkin seed showed an effort increase, but no harvest change. So potentially these are not species of consumption interest for folks, but we'll see. These are still trends that are happening. So what have we learned so far? The modeling approach that we took, it was able to incorporate abiotic and angler access information across these multiple years and locations. We recognized some certain limitations. This only focused on lakes, and so certainly rivers and other types of water bodies are going to experience potentially even higher recreational fisheries harvest in different types that are not captured in this type of analysis. That would be really, really good to try to understand further. The surveys that we're focusing on, or that we're using for the empirical data, are potentially walleye biased and spatially limited, but at the same time, our driver data and the data analysis that we did we did strive to incorporate that variance. That we do feel that one of the strengths was that we use this intermediate scale to extrapolate based on data rather than a single value. Overall, based off of the drivers that we found, again, this was a grouped model, so not species specific. This was just fish biomass. We found that warmer, more productive lakes resulted in higher harvest, and that the drivers of harvest were thermal characteristics, productivity characteristics, and angler access. So somewhat what you would imagine if anyone's familiar with kind of historical models predicting fish yield, the morphodaphic index, that type of thing. Those are also along these same lines. And overall, what we just found from this is that it's really important to recognize the regional differences among inland recreational harvests, and that if one were to try to take a global approach or a national approach or something like that, it'd be important to take this mosaic approach where you might model at smaller levels and then stitch it together to really understand what was going on. Because even at a model like we had for the state of Wisconsin, lakes right next to each other had really different harvest levels. And so there was just a lot of variability to consider. All right, we found from a species specific perspective that there was this harvest switching potentially by this group of consumptive fishers, where bluegill and black crappie and largemouth bass seem to increasingly become these species of consumption interest, which again follows the species trend. So in the state of Wisconsin and lakes, centrarchids like bluegill, black crappie, and largemouth bass are increasing in abundance, while some cool water species like walleye are declining. And so potentially consumptive anglers may be less selective and compensate by switching to other species when these declines occur. But again, anglers are tricky. And so these more skilled anglers may go over the top of this and keep harvest levels the same, as some other work has shown from Feiner et al. So I think this is a really important thing that we'll want to disentangle for future work to understand the interplay between consumptive oriented anglers and non-consumptive oriented anglers, and how that affects harvest and effort trends over time. And overall, what we just found is that recreational anglers are harvesting a lot of fish. That has a lot of implications for food, where there's almost equal consumption from these course estimates. And so this may be a key source of food for certain communities, and it would certainly be great to refine these estimates. This is this was a bulk model, basically, where we were just predicting biomass harvested. We just wanted to know how much fish was coming out of Wisconsin lakes. But I think if we had better, not necessarily better creel data, the creel data is fantastic, but better like driver data, some of this predictor data was went back a little bit far and stuff like that. If we had better data in that respect, we may be able to refine our estimates and predict better upon different water bodies, as well as to build species specific models. So predict walleye harvest specifically, bluegill harvest specifically, to really hone in on what those drivers may be. So I don't know necessarily if drivers for walleye harvest would be exactly the same as for bluegill harvest. I don't think warmer waters is necessarily going to be the same thing there. So I think that would be the next step beyond this. And then from an economic perspective, if these folks were to go and buy this fish or this food in a store, it's this value that goes unmeasured and undervalued. And it also goes to support their nutritional security. This is food that you can't really buy a bluegill in a store. And so, but it has specific nutrients and value that is hard to quantify. And so I think these are just all the types of things that we need to consider when we think about recreational fisheries and their importance. So when I think about the future and where we go from here, I want to really just emphasize that creel data is super, super valuable. This felt like the first go and a first initial stop along the way for creel data. So I feel like we're just kind of scraping the surface. These estimates are coarse and just a starting point. They don't encapsulate lots of other fishing. Specifically, I think what's really important for especially the Midwest region is trying to understand tribal fishing. This again was just recreational fishing from where the motivation is primarily leisure driven. And trying to understand different motivations for different fishers and how that affects different fisheries would be a really interesting future path. Lakes and fisheries are super dynamic. This again represents a snapshot of potential harvest. So I think it's interesting to think about how harvest may change as a function of different angler decisions, landscape types, climate change, and there's tons of other things that we can potentially think about, but this provides maybe a foundation to think beyond. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about this national project that we're working on at USGS, where we're bringing together, called CreelCat. It's the US Inland Creel and Angler Survey Catalog, where we're bringing together all of the creel surveys that we can possibly get, basically from 48 states and Puerto Rico and Washington, DC, and then building a user interface so managers and researchers can interact with the national database of creel information to filter and summarize and visualize their creel data to then hopefully extend the utility of creel data and to really learn from it. Because again, it feels like we're just scratching the surface and digging into lots of the exciting things that we can learn from it. And both within Wisconsin and the Midwest area, but then beyond, and draw different comparisons across these landscapes. So with that, most of this Wisconsin focused stuff is published in a paper in Fisheries, and the CreelCat stuff will be available soon too in a paper in Fisheries. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And with that, I'm happy to take comments or questions. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you, Holly, very much. Right now, we would normally, in a regular presentation, I'll be clapping and congratulating you. Hopefully, I can speak on behalf of the 30 or 40 people that have attended throughout and say thank you. I think this is really interesting and I think informative. So a reminder for folks that are in the audience, if you have any questions, now is the time to submit them through the Q&A function or in the Q&A function, please. So I'll be keeping an eye out for those. There will be a recording of this webinar again, and I'll email out the link to that recording once it's been posted. So if you, for some reason, weren't able to see the whole recording, if your kids started throwing a fit right in the middle of it, or whatever the case may be, or if you have colleagues that you want to share it with, then you'll be able to do that. So please make sure to send any questions in through the Q&A function now, and we'll get started with those. Holly, I will say that this paper is one that I cite in almost every proposal that I write these days, just because it's so foundational, I think, to be able to demonstrate how important fish harvest is for our economies and connecting it to things that people care about, outside of the fisheries world. So this is a really, I think, important paper.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so we've got a question from Ralph Bednarts. He said, have you looked at the fish tissue contaminants and fish consumption advisories as potential impacts on inland recreational fish harvest and consumption over time, or with regard to specific species?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's not something that we really touched on here or focused on for this study, but that is certainly something that you would want to consider for like any study, any large scale consumption studies moving forward. We did make the assumption, I should have mentioned that earlier, that all of the fish harvested and estimated to be harvested during creel surveys were consumed by people, at least like 35% of them, which is an assumption and doesn't take into consideration the fact that some fish are contaminated and people are potentially making decisions based off of those advisories. But at the same time, it would be assumed that if they were harvesting, they would have considered that and not necessarily harvested a fish that they would have. But I do think that as fish contaminants and those types of drivers change over time and across space, that'll be something that would be really interesting to look at and incorporate into our understanding of harvest and effort dynamics, I think, especially to really, yeah, think about are people taking that into consideration? Is that a safe assumption? The assumption that we made that people are considering the contaminants in the water body and then harvesting the fish, and they're only doing that in the case that it would be appropriate. So yeah, that isn't necessarily something that we considered in this study, but it is something that we're thinking about and something that is very important to think about, I think, down the line for sure.
Sort of the flip side, and I think based on your answer, I know what you're going to say here, but did the fish consumption folks that create those advisories in Wisconsin, when they saw this study, how did they react to it and what were their thoughts? Did they have concerns?
They didn't really have concerns. I mean, these harvest estimates are actually, I mean, they're relatively conservative, like relatively low compared to what would get you sick. So, I mean, like 1.1 kilograms per angler per year is a very conservative amount of fish. That's not going to get anybody sick. So I guess depending on where you're getting it from. But we haven't heard from anyone that they've found these like levels of harvest concerning in any way. If anything, most folks' reactions have been like, oh, that seems a little bit lower than I would have anticipated.
Yeah. Okay. I don't see any questions on the Q&A function coming in, but I have lots. So and hopefully you can entertain my questions, and if other folks have them, they can speak up. So the creel surveys that you guys did, were those year-round creel surveys? Did they capture ice fishing and open water seasons?
Yeah, it basically runs for the walleye season. So like May 1st through March, April. So yeah, through the winter season, and then just shuts for a little for walleye spawning, basically.
Gotcha. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's a really valuable data source then.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Next question from me was, so your numbers are kind of, you start by creating an average, and then you take that average and you scale it up. And it's really difficult. And I don't know that your data really allow you to look at individual anglers and how they're catching over time throughout the course of the year. But do you have any, whether it was from these data or from other data that you've seen, do you have any sense for kind of what the variance is around these numbers and the average that you provide? Because, like you said, it might be that most people are catching very few, and then there are a handful of anglers that are just catching a ton. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I've never looked fully at the temporal, like daily, or I guess, yeah, I've never looked at the data on a temporal scale, but I do have a sense from conversations with folks like Zach Feiner, who I know is on this call, who it does seem like harvest is dominated by a smaller group of anglers than like the general public. The vast majority of folks are not harvesting the bulk of the fish. It seems like the majority. Same with catch. It's like there's skilled anglers, there's folks who are just kind of out there hanging out. And so I would imagine that would hold true throughout the year, that when those folks are out there, harvest would spike. But yeah, I could be wrong. I haven't actually seen that data.
Yeah. Just one of the many questions I think that are interesting and important, probably raised by this study. Let's see. I'm going down we got some more questions coming in now. Okay. I think Zach and I were asking the same question here. So Nathan Miller asks, when will we see a survey regarding Wisconsin's rivers?
That would be a great question for DNR folks, but they do exist. I shouldn't have said that they don't. I don't know if I said they don't fully exist. There are some creel surveys on rivers in Wisconsin. They're just a bit limited. It's just really, really hard to creel a river because there's just multiple access points and folks are kind of all over the place. And so there are limited, yeah, we just didn't include that data in this because it's just so limited and it would have just been really challenging to extrapolate, but those do somewhat exist. And so I think DNR does some creel river, some creel river surveys.
That's interesting. That's sort of the complement to what we do here in Michigan. I think we have more heavily creel our rivers in the Great Lakes.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Paul Frater asks, any speculation, he says, great job first. And then any speculation or anecdotes on how you think results might change if creel surveys were spread more evenly throughout the state, so more of the South and closer to the urban areas?
Yeah, so I think that's a really cool question. And I would love if there was more, especially in those urban areas, if there were more creel surveys done. I think that's a super interesting difference between those kind of like rural, northern lakes of Wisconsin compared to like the urban water bodies near Madison or Milwaukee or something. I think those angler groups are really different. I think harvest would probably be a lot higher. And especially given that the drivers that we found predicting higher harvest were, I mean, accessibility. So that's not really an issue there. And then warmer and productive. So those water bodies would probably produce lots of fish, and you've got ample angler access and ample angling effort and potentially also a group of anglers that is more consumptive oriented. Just kind of anecdotally from what I've spoken to folks about, when you see people out there, they seem to be very harvest oriented and eating the fish that they're harvesting. So yeah, I think it would actually be higher, the harvest estimate.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I'm aware of some fisheries here in Michigan where it's a particular lake, and there's particular cultural group that's really interested in catching one type of fish,
right?
And it's really important. You might even say that it's more of a subsistence fishery than a recreational fishery at that point.
Exactly. And those types, the like urban fisheries too, and like what you're describing, are especially where it gets like really challenging to distinguish that like fuzzy boundary, because it's like, is their primary motivation leisure? Is it subsistence? It's, I guess in the state of Wisconsin or Michigan, it's easy enough to say they have an angling license, that's a recreational fishery. But in other parts of the world where it's less regulated and stuff, it gets really challenging to figure out like what is a recreational fishery even.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Oh, can you remind us why most of the creel surveys were from northern Wisconsin and not more balanced? I think you said it.
Yeah. So it stems back to the management kind of framework for Wisconsin that's tailored around walleye. And so most walleye lakes are in the ceded territory of Wisconsin, which is the northern third of Wisconsin, which is tailored around walleye management. And so walleye lakes in the ceded territory. And so that's where the majority of surveys are done. And yeah, management attention, from my understanding. I could be missing quite a few nuances there.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Have there been any studies in regard to the impacts of populations and health metrics for fish harvested in open water compared to ice fishing?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's probably a good question, better suited for like Zach Viner, who I think has done some ice work. We didn't break any of this stuff down between seasons or between like ice on season versus ice off season. But I think other folks like Zach have potentially dug deeper into the creel data, and that's certainly something that's available, or that would be possible to dig into in the creel data, and we want to know about, I think, down the line if it hasn't already been figured out, because I think that would be very interesting. I know a project going on now is very specifically focusing on bluegill and thinking about winter kind of mortality associated with ice fishing and bluegill and how that relates to summer mortality and shifts over time. So yeah, there's stuff in the works, but I personally haven't really dug too deep into that.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Mhm.
See, another question, can you talk a little bit more about the creel cat and if that information is going to be available to the public?
Absolutely, yes. So that is all going to be publicly available. We're currently, I believe, I actually could post a thing in the chat, or maybe I'll send it to you and then you can send it out after. We have the Shiny app. So the creel cat user interface is going to have it's built on a Shiny app. And so that is fully accessible to the public, and you will be able to interact with all the data and filter and summarize. And then we have multiple visualization tools on there. And then you can also, if it's preferable, just download the data set for yourself. And so we're in the process right now of kind of QA/QCing some of the data and getting final checks in there. But the intention is to have it fully publicly available in about a month, at the time when our paper will also be coming out in Fisheries. And so that should all be publicly available, and we want people to use it. So please go and use creel cat and use the data.
What are the 2 states that will not be in it?
The 2 states that will not be in it are Colorado and California.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nobody in the Midwest, so we can
No,
say
Midwest
things about
is
them.
fantastic. Midwest has fantastic data, and Midwest, yeah, fantastic stuff. Lots of great Midwest coverage.
I'll note Zach Feiner, who you referenced, did kind of weigh in and just mention that trends are different between seasons. This is back again with regard to the mortality question. They've got a project to start thinking about effort changes in compression due to changes in ice phenology, so how long ice is on a lake, and then winter catch and release mortality as well. So lots of ongoing research in Wisconsin DNR looking at some of the questions we're touching on here as well. Okay. I don't see any additional questions coming in. So I'll say this is the last call for questions. If you have them, please type them in. And again, Holly, thank you for the presentation. I think, it's been really valuable and very much appreciated. Plug for the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership. Again, we've got 3 more webinars coming up this fall. I believe that the next, I'm going to get myself in trouble because I don't have them in front of me. The next 2 anyway are one on structured decision making for habitat in inland lakes, and then after that is, or around that time, is also one on fish kills and looking at fish kills in Wisconsin and Minnesota and trying to understand better how an analysis of all fish kills from a very large data set can inform our knowledge of fish disease in those 2 states. And then our last webinar for this fall will be looking at managing tribal fisheries. So I encourage you to check out the website on the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership website if you're interested in hearing any of those webinars. And so with that, I see no additional questions, so I think we'll wrap it up. Again, Holly, thank you very much. And to everybody, have a good day.